Hello and welcome to the Efficio Spotlight podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb and thank you very much for listening. For today's discussion, I'm extremely pleased to say that I'm joined by Rob Woodstock. Rob is the Commercial Director of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which is the UK central government department responsible for tax, payment and customs duty. Rob and his team are responsible for managing a spend of about £1.5 billion. Today, actually, we wanted to talk to Rob specifically in a personal capacity, and we wanted to talk actually about issues connected to diversity inclusion, but especially from the lens of Black and ethnic minority people. So I'm delighted that Rob has agreed to kind of have this conversation with me and share his story. And so to that, Rob, I guess you're a very high profile, very successful Black man in our industry and in wider world. It'd just be really interesting to understand how you arrived here and kind of your personal experience.
Great. Well, thanks, Simon. Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to share a bit of me and my journey and to get into a bit of a conversation about race. It's sometimes a difficult topic, so I'm always happy to put myself out there and look forward to you being able to ask any question in whatever way you feel is necessary. I'm very, very happy to do that. I'm very relaxed about anything you want to ask me. But to kick off, I think there are probably a few stories I'd like to share about sort of life and work to set the scene. So I'm a British Black man, and my background is from the Caribbean. So my parents are from Jamaica and Grenada. And I'm a bit of a mix, really. I sort of view myself as a bit of a one-person melting pot. My dad is African by sort of descent, going back over many generations, and my mum is Indian. So I have a couple of different perspectives from the point of view of heritage there, and also that identity of being really closely connected with the Caribbean, but being very proud of being British. I think the stories I want to tell really revolve around three people, three men as it happens, who really influenced my life at different points. Okay. I want to start right at the beginning with my first few years of life, which has really shaped me. So I was born in London. My parents, and my dad in particular, made quite an early decision when I was about 3 or 4 to move out of London. And they did that because they thought they'd have better prospects for the family moving out of London and moving somewhere with a bit different sort of environment, different job opportunities and so on. So we moved to a place in Northamptonshire, very different setting, away from all our extended family. I have a very large family, many aunts and uncles and cousins and all this sort of stuff, but we moved out as a single unit. And that was a very brave step, I think, he took, and a bit of a personal sacrifice. He really did it to get his kids into a good place. So the first thing that's happened to me is I was really fortunate that I had a dad who stuck around, but also made this important decision, which was arguably not the best thing for him, but definitely the best thing for us as kids. At that time in the 70s, and my parents having come to the UK in the 60s, I would say they came across in what was quite a hostile environment, and they anticipated that in the 70s, being very much in the minority, that we'd be in a tough environment as kids. My dad had this sort of thing that he drummed into me of, I want you to at all times do your best and I want you to be the best, which is a simple thing to say, but quite hard, I think, for a young kid to hear. So I had extra lessons from my dad before I go out and play football with my mates. We moved on to a council estate, and so it was a little bit rough, to be honest, in terms of the environment. But he was really clear that he wanted me to have an academic record and achievement that he hadn't had. He'd been forced to leave school when he was 15 and really regretted that. He's a bright guy, he could quite easily have sort of gone on to further education. And so anything I did at school, I'd report back to my dad, I'd done really well in a particular test. And he'd always want to know, what I would need to do to get 10 out of 10 instead of 8 out of 10 the spelling test. And, if I was second in the class, he'd sort of say, well, that's all very well, but you need to be first. And his motivation was really that he felt that society wouldn't treat me fairly and that I would need to do better than other people in order to compete. I really didn't like hearing this as a kid, but it did me a lot of good. I really took to that as a child, and I became a sort of results machine at a young age. I pushed myself pretty hard, and I happened to have some aptitude. And so that served me well throughout my life and my career, and I'll come back to that a bit later on. Having been on this council estate for a bit, my dad decided he wanted to move us to a sort of safer environment, a better and safer environment still. So we moved to a village, a very small village. I think there's probably 1,000 or 2,000 people. And so we were very much the only Black family in that area, in that village, the only black kids at school, me and my brother and sister. And so it was kind of a strange experience because of the novelty of that, because of the pushback that I received, quite a lot of pushback from other kids and sometimes from adults as well. But I did a lot to adapt myself to fit in. And I also really took to that environment. So I joined the local football team, I joined the Scouts, we went to church, so I joined the choir. So I was a sort of choir boy in the cassock and the ruffle and all the sort of traditional Anglican way of living. So I would say I'm very anglicised as a person.
Yeah.
I'm about as English as it gets. Definitely British, but very, very English, that sort of middle England way of life. And I think that has been really important to me in my career, in not feeling as if I'm other. When around other people. When I'm the only black person in the room, it really doesn't bother me at all. It's absolutely fine. And then presenting myself in a way that others can easily identify with and accept. And later in my career, when it became apparent that careers were influenced, if not made, in the pub and around talking about football or whatever, that I actually benefited in a way from a kind of privilege there that maybe some of my female counterparts and maybe those with other religious beliefs didn't. So whilst I am black and a bit different, actually, because of my upbringing, I'm able to be part of a lot of the mainstream culture of the environments I was working in. So that was my dad, sort of the man in my life, number one.
And sorry, Rob, to that point, as a kid in that environment, did you feel that pressure and that need to fit in, or was it something that just happened because that's where you were and that's what it was?
But I feel there wasn't a choice.
Right.
So I was removed from an environment where I'd have lots of references to other people who might speak with a Caribbean accent and eat the food and listen to music. So I had that at home, but I very much changed the moment I left the door and became very English. I can't recall whether I sort of sat down and had a conversation with myself saying, you must do this, but I didn't feel there was a choice. I had to do it. And I didn't feel a price of doing it at the time. Right. Now, I feel a bit differently about it now, but at the time it was just, there are some friends, they're playing football, let's just go in like any other kid, I guess. Try and fit in, be their mates and blend in as much as possible. So a natural act, I would say. Another childhood thing, when I was a teenager, I did pretty well on lots of different fronts, in sports, on the academic side. But there are a couple of things that happened to me that I think are worth sort of bringing out. I serially found that people had low expectations of me. And there's one incident that happened that really sort of brings that to life. We had sort of these series of careers days, and we had a chap come in to talk to us about astrophysics. I don't know why they'd invited this chap on. Anyway, he came, and I was quite interested, quite a narrow career to get into, but he came along to give us a bit of a talk. I was really interested in astronomy, a bit nerdy as a kid. I had a telescope, I looked at the stars, that sort of stuff. And I went to speak to him after his talk. I said, I'm really interested in this, and I'd quite like maybe to do astrophysics at uni. And he looked at me and said, well, you'll need to be really good at maths to do that. And I said, well, I'm pretty good at maths. And he looked at me again and said, no, really good. And it was clear that he thought I was aiming for something that was well outside of my capabilities. He had decided, just looking at me, he'd know nothing about me, didn't know what set I was in at class, but he'd seen a black boy come up and show some interest in this highly academic, quite stretching field, and decided that it wasn't for me. And he was trying to talk me out of it. That's an example of what's happened many times in my career, of people looking at me and figuring that I won't do a good job or won't be able to do something that I think is within my capability. And fortunately, because my dad had motivated me so much when I was a kid, I was really clear about setting quite high goals for myself and going for it and not really listening to other people. My view is it was all down to me to kind of set my own trajectory, if you like. I also had an incident which was quite painful. It's quite painful to relive. So I loved playing football, but there were a couple of places I went to which were quite difficult for me because those towns were very racist. They were actively racist, I would say. It wouldn't be just sort of odd looks, but people would say things. And I got into one particular game where the opposition team had decided that they were going to hit me, kick me, do whatever they felt they could do to put me off or to hurt me throughout this football match. I was with my teammates, many of whom were friends. We certainly got on really well. I would say they were definitely not racist.
Yeah.
But they didn't really do anything at this time. So they saw this happening. They sort of sympathised and empathised with me. But it was very much down to me to fight back. And to fight my own corner. And even I think I had a couple of adults who were watching the match from the side saying, hit them back. And my dad had always said to me that I should take care of number one. It's something I hated as a child. I wanted to take care of other people. I believe we're all in it together. Yeah. But I learned really in that moment that I had to be self-reliant. And sometimes when push comes to shove, you are on your own. Or that's the conclusion I had to come to from that experience. So a bit battered and bruised and really disappointed. And I really couldn't understand why my friends hadn't helped me. It's interesting to reflect on that, because I think when people see something that they disagree with, they sometimes expect the person who is being victimized to step in and deal with it themselves. If there's a comment over dinner and someone's being homophobic, that maybe the gay person around the table will pipe up and say something, and everyone else is sort of watching to see whether they'll do it. And it's really important on this agenda around race to understand the difference between not agreeing with something bad that's happening and stepping in and actively supporting the person who's being victimized. And that's the difference between not being racist and being anti-racist. And maybe we can come to that and talk about that a bit more further down the line. So that's sort of the childhood stuff. I joined a consultancy after uni, what I thought was really a dream job with a dream lifestyle. For someone from humble backgrounds, reading a brochure saying you could be flying around the world and serving clients and doing all sorts of things was really great for me. It sort of suited my idea of being the best. Which was sort of programmed into me when I was a kid. And I absolutely loved the job. I was really dedicated to it. I would say my job and my career came first. And even at the point where I had my first child, if I'm honest with myself, my career was taking precedent over family life, that desire to be successful, that need and desire to be successful. And at a point where I had been there for a while, I was in sort of the management levels and thinking about maybe I can make it and become a partner, which was sort of the big apex and objective of anyone's career. I think, the consultancy is sort of, that's the carrot that's held out for you. I was attracted to a partner who was doing great work, was really innovative, and I thought I'd be able to learn a lot from. He was also a man who was very difficult to work for. He was very difficult to please. He rejected people a lot on capability. If they weren't brilliant, he would say, "You're not very good." I mean, almost literally tell them they weren't good enough and move on. I introduced myself to him. We sort of went through the motions of him, finding out a bit about me. And at the end of that conversation, he said, "Look, it's all really good. I'm really glad we had the conversation, but I don't really have anything for you now." But I persisted, and I wouldn't quite say I stalked him, but I kept going to the point where I could have created an opportunity, and I would do anything he would ask, almost literally anything he would ask, in order to pass his test. It's a bit like being in the Marines or something. There were some things you had to do, and if you got through them, you were in, and if you didn't, you were out.
And did you identify him as the guy to pursue because he had these characteristics, because he was difficult but good? Because
he was good, definitely not because he was difficult. But I thought the projects he did were really interesting. They were definitely the most innovative projects. They were exciting, and he seemed like someone who was going places himself and would be a good person to follow. I literally did everything he wanted me to do. I got through the test, and then things changed, and he became an advocate and a teacher. So if I was doing a presentation, he not only would tell me what I needed to do, but we would sit afterwards. If he'd seen the presentation, we'd discuss it. He would describe in detail, what I should have put on the slide, how I should have said the thing I said, and the psychology behind giving presentations, how to build confidence. He put a lot of time into me. And I think he was really the first really meaningful sponsor I had at work who was going to do things differently for me. He let other people know that I was capable and that he thought I had potential. And that was really important just in terms of setting expectations for everyone else around. That here's someone who is essentially been anointed, if you like, by this quite senior partner. So a massive difference to me. And I think sponsorship in that really proactive form is very powerful. So it's very different to mentoring, which is listening to people and giving them a prod in the right direction, and really actively stepping in, deciding which assignments I would do, pulling me onto the most interesting piece of work that was happening. Let's make sure Woodstock's on this team. Really, really great for me. That level of advocacy, I think, is hard to find. I found out through a personal conversation, because usually with sponsors and sometimes with mentors, you become friends, that in his time in the military, he had worked with a black guy who had a hard time, who was very capable, but had not qualified. And I can't recall exactly what it was. I don't know if they were training to be pilots or something, but hadn't qualified. And he thought it was a real shame. And it was just because of his colour. And in a way, this was his way of paying back for the injustice he had seen in his early military career. So I was really fortunate that I found this guy, and he had an ulterior motive in a way, to support me. I still had to pass the test though. I still had to do all the good things and work the hours he wanted to work and so on. But it became a really good symbiotic relationship. I made partner, and I got into a period which I would describe as a period of really high achievement. My profile internally and external became really good. But I would also say it came with a lot of pressure, a lot of self-imposed pressure, because being a black partner when there aren't many, I'm not sure there were any at that time, I couldn't fail. I needed to be the best. That means performing in meetings, being profound in my comments in meetings, not just saying ordinary things, but saying things that people think this guy's really good.
And you actually felt that pressure that as the black partner, it wasn't just you, it was you were carrying much more, right?
Definitely. I mean, so for every black person who congratulated me on being partner, they didn't say it, but I sort of heard, you're representing us, don't mess it up. From my own background, I had this sort of desire to be the best. So if you're going to be a partner, you don't just be an ordinary one, be a really, really good one. And I felt that if I didn't do well, it might have consequences for other people. So, and I could see people watching me. I could see a lot of the white partners watching. So my sales needed to be really good, going to clients when they've bought a partner called Rob Woodstock and they've seen the CV, and then I walk through the door. Really interesting to see people's expressions. Again, people aren't racist necessarily. They're just a bit surprised to see me. One or two clients gave me a test. I remember one in particular who, on the day I arrived, sort of looked at me and thought, well, I could see him thinking, I'll give this guy a chance. But he gave me a problem, if you like, to solve overnight. I want it on my desk tomorrow morning. So, of course, I went away and did it. And when I saw him the next morning and I showed him my work, he was blown away. Again, he had low expectations and I was able to exceed them. And he said, actually, this is really good, almost in a surprised way.
Yeah.
So lots of pressure, I think, at the time, a lot of performance, but I think it took a lot out of me. I would describe this a bit like flying from London to New York, where you can look at the stats for pilots who make that flight, and you can see a set of pilots who are doing it in 5.5 or 6 hours, and another set who are doing it in 7 hours, and who are using more fuel. And you sort of think, well, maybe these people are performing differently. Well, I think what happens in the Atlantic is that there's the trade winds, and some people have the wind at their back and can go faster. It's the same distance, it's the same plane, it's the same number of passengers, but others have a bit more of a headwind. And so I would describe the reality and my own pressure I put on myself as a real headwind, and the amount of energy I put then into achieving the same thing, I think, was different to my white colleagues. I hope that makes sense to you.
It does. It makes absolute sense, yeah.
And I think sometimes people talk about privilege. I think that creates a sort of negative reaction sometimes in non-BAME people. But I look at it as a sort of headwind and having the wind at your back, and the difference between those two things. And if you're non-BAME, you can view yourself as almost not noticing that the wind is at your back. And if you're BAME, you can feel that wind, but others can't necessarily see and feel it. I had another sponsor at that point, someone who met me as a more junior partner, seemed to really like me and the work I did, called me into his office and made it really clear that he thought I had potential. So that conversation again, and was going to help me to become a more senior partner. Did all of the things that the previous sponsor did, who had left by this time, and really made it clear that I was someone who he thought was going places. It turns out that this guy who was running the UK business, so he was about as senior as it gets on the patch, had grown up in Jamaica. He had been a diplomat or something, and so he'd spent some time there. He had a soft spot for people from the Caribbean. He had a real affinity with the Caribbean, and so there was a personal interest there, and he was really hot on inclusion and diversity, and that was the legacy he wanted to leave behind, of course, growing the business, but he also was really clear about gender, ethnicity, disability, a whole range of different things that he wanted to make sure that the place felt differently. And I was, again, there was a bit of a deal there that I would help him on that front, make sure I did really good work, but that he would visibly help me. So he's the third man, I would say. My dad, first of all, sort of setting me off with those expectations, the innovator who really showed me how I could be a good partner, set me up for that, and then the person who sort of helped me to become a more senior, rounded leader. There are many, many stories to tell. There are a few there, hopefully, that sort of give you a bit of an explanation as to why I am where I am, with the benefit of help from other people and a mindset and a background which has made it easier than most from my background to be able to blend, to fit in, and to feel comfortable working in what is a predominantly white environment, particularly the more senior you get.
Yeah, as you say, it's fascinating. It's a combination, it sounds like, of your personal attributes and tenacity and the drive to get some tailwinds, but also a lot of headwinds that you had to kind of cut through and come out of the other side of. We spoke before actually about this idea of code switching, which is a concept I wasn't aware of. Maybe for the people listening, if you could kind of give a bit of context to that, because again, maybe it sounds like from your personal experience in the move to Middle England was a form of code switching, maybe not you deliberately chose, that kind of happened. And it'd be good to get your context on that.
Code switching is something that particularly people from minorities need to do or have the option to do in order to blend in, to be accepted more easily. And what I described in my childhood of sort of living one way within the four walls of the Woodstock household and then stepping over the threshold and then becoming more English, sort of changing almost the outlook and personality. This is what code switching is about. There's a really good BBC Sounds podcast. I highly recommend people listen to that. And it essentially describes a sort of ranking of positive perception of people from voice only. It's a good way of describing that aspect of code switching. So in the podcast, they describe a recruiting exercise where a number of statements are read out. They're the same statement read out by different people. And then a surveyed population responds to that and feeds back on how credible that person is perceived to be. And for someone with an accent a bit like mine, a sort of Southern English accent, a little bit posh, really good pronunciation, it gets a really high level of credibility. And as you go north, the level of credibility goes down. The words are exactly the same, but the perception is different. And it really drops when you get to any hint of ethnicity. So for that reason, I think people from a background a bit like my relatives who stayed in London, who have a bit more of a discernible black British London accent, just in opening their mouths and me opening my mouth, there's a difference in the way we're perceived. And some people have made that decision consciously to code switch. For me, it's a small thing because my life has been code switched all the way through. Yeah. But for people who are entering the corporate world, having been in let's describe it as a more urban environment in a city like London, it's a really much more conscious act to give a bit of yourself up as you enter the office and to assume a slightly different persona in order to be accepted. And it's just one example of what non-BAME people might not appreciate is happening for their colleagues. Yep. And maybe the unconscious bias that comes with that. I think if we're honest with ourselves, and as the survey has shown, we do have a different view of people based on some really quick decisions we make about their background, and that links to their capability. So I think code switching is a really interesting topic to look at.
Your life, your experience has brought you to this place you're at now. But I guess in terms of when you're talking to colleagues or other people in the industry about your topic, how do we create more success stories like yours is? What collectively responsibility do we hold to be the advocates, to be all those things that you had, right, for other people?
Being proactively inclusive of people who are different takes work. I just described that survey, and it's not a conscious act. There's something unconscious that's happening there, and getting underneath that and understanding it, takes a bit of time. So I think there's a need for some education. So for people who are not from an ethnic minority background to spend some time on this topic, getting to understand it a bit more. I think in order for things to change, there's probably a limit on what Black, Asian and minority ethnic people can do themselves. So the onus really is on the white population to lean in and to really understand this. And really the difference between not being racist and anti-racist, I think, is key. Yes. Where an anti-racist will not allow a comment that's unacceptable to be made, even if there isn't an ethnic minority person around. It's to be really clear that if they hear anything that sounds like it's biased or sounds like it's racist, to challenge a colleague on that. I think that's the sort of test when no one else, when there isn't a Black person looking, around, will you say something? Just to kind of really constrain the space for people to continue to have those unacceptable beliefs, and then to proactively support and challenge colleagues. We have had a period through COVID where I think a lot of organisations have put special teams together. Those teams have had access to senior leaders. They've operated in an agile way, which is probably instructive of how they'll operate in the future. I wonder how many organisations looked at those teams and thought, let's make sure we've got a diverse team here. Let's make sure we've got some of our BAME talent involved in this, because this is a key moment that's going to help to build careers.
Yeah.
So that sort of education, being prepared to step in, and also thinking about how we create opportunities. If you look at my sponsors, they would definitely have had Rob Woodstock on the COVID response team because they knew it was important, and they're things that are in everyone's control.
So I was kind of reflecting on us having this conversation, which I think is fascinating, right? Really important. But I personally had a sense, which I don't normally, of being very conscious of not wanting to say the wrong thing or ask you the wrong question or use the wrong terminology or whatever it might be. And hopefully I haven't done any of those things, but in a way that I weirdly wouldn't in other podcasts we might do or on other topics. Right? Do you think there's part of this which are important opportunities for learnings and conversations aren't happening because people are a little bit too conscious of some of these issues or not?
I agree. I think it's really difficult to navigate. It's difficult because of the history. It's difficult because no one would want to be labelled a racist. I think that's the fear, I guess, that something you say might then be held up as evidence that you hold some unsavoury views. I really encourage my colleagues from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds to just be part of creating the space for people to say what they feel in a safe environment.
Yeah.
And to not jump in too quickly if something sounds as if it's not quite as we would like it, because the more we listen, the more people are able to really freely express what they think, the easier the conversation becomes. We've had a series of conversations across our organisation, and they've even been difficult when there isn't a BAME person in the room. So some teams have reported back, we found this just a difficult thing. We were kind of struggling. So of course, when you and I are speaking, that sort of ups the ante, doesn't it, really, in terms of making sure or trying to make sure that you don't cross any lines. But I'm personally an advocate of people just saying what they really think and using education and examples to maybe give a bit of a steer.
Yeah.
I think even if you talk to people who are from an ethnic minority background, they won't all agree on what is an acceptable term or phrase. I was on a live stream call, and one of the comments I had was people who didn't like the term BAME.
Yes, which is one of the ones I went through in my thought process. I'm like, Is that the right term, the wrong term? Should I think of something else?
And it's tricky. So I think, as I've said to people, the most important thing is to have the conversation and to focus on the actions that follow. If we get distracted by a debate on whether it should be BAME or some other description, that's missing the point. So, and I certainly, for BAME people, wouldn't want them to wake up in the morning and think, I'm BAME. I don't wake up in the morning and think I think I'm a black man, I think I'm British. And so that identity that I described at the beginning of my life and career story is the one that I hold. And people shouldn't be trying to compromise that in any way. But it's a bit of a label that allows us to focus our effort on a particular problem or opportunity. And for those of us in business, it's good to have something like that we all agree is a term that we're going to work with, and we shouldn't get too hung up about it. But it is quite difficult. But let's make sure we create that space and have good conversations, and for non-BAME people to do it without fear, and for BAME colleagues to be generous.
And probably lastly, Rob, thank you for having this conversation. It's been fascinating and I think really important. If I'm listening to this podcast, I'm a young BAME individual. What are things I should be thinking? What are the things that I could be positive about?
I think there is a desire in business, in government, to really understand in a way that hasn't been the case before. I think people have set targets before. They've said, there's a problem, there's something we want to do differently. I mean, on some occasions, targets have been set, but I'm encouraged by the amount of time that's being taken, the media, even if you look at the amount of content that's available at the moment, and listening to, for many colleagues, are curious and investing that time and wanting to understand. I think that's going to create more awareness and more opportunity for BAME people in a whole variety of different settings. So I think the resources are there that mean that you don't have to explain it all yourself. You can point people in the right direction. I think, I and my colleagues, young and old, are maintaining a sense of skepticism, actually healthy skepticism, about whether 2020 will be the year Black Lives Matter had a bit of profile, people beat their chest a bit and said how awful it all was, but didn't follow through.
Right.
I think what we're looking for is multi-year commitments. And I certainly see in the organisations that I'm closest to that we are making those commitments multi-year. I've seen through social media some, big organisations, my alma mater, Accenture sort of said, over a period of time, these are the specific targets they have. And I think that's really good to see if they can stick to that and measure progress on the way. And I think on this subject of code switching, that there is a bit of a change there. I mean, my personal advice to young people would be code switch.
Right.
Do not code switch. But it is noticeable that the boundaries of code switching, I think, are changing. I don't know whether you've noticed in the media, I've noticed some presenters, black presenters, you see black men will quite often shave their hair very short. It's less African, I think, as a result. That's identifiable as being different. And I've seen them starting to show up more with a bit more of an afro growing, a bit more hair on show, a bit more of an ethnic twist to the way they present themselves. And so there's definitely a sort of nudging of the boundaries there, but not sufficiently that you can, I believe, be your completely authentic home self and turn up to the office and expect equal treatment and outcomes. And I think that applies for lots of people. I think, someone with a thick Glaswegian accent probably learns over time to find a way to reduce the thickness of the accent so that it's easier for people to understand, and so they might be perceived a little differently. And it is sad, but that's the reality. So some really good things there, but also just a recognition that you do have to be street smart in the office, and you do have to do some things to progress. But I'm optimistic.
Rob, thank you so much. As I say, fascinating conversation. Really appreciate it. When we publish this podcast, alongside that, we'll put some links. You mentioned a podcast on code switching. We'll link to that and some other recommendations for people that want to kind of progress this discussion. If people have comments, thoughts, please let us know on LinkedIn or other places. We'd be delighted to carry the conversation on. But Rob, we really appreciate your time. Your story is a fascinating one, and delighted you chose to share it with us. So thank you.
Thanks for having me, Simon. It's been great to have the opportunity to chat, and I've really enjoyed it.